want to share a story with y'all that I read this week. It's a story about a woman. In fact, it's a story about a widow. A widow who lived a long, long time ago, back in the days when widows had no status. They had no political status. They had no legal status. In fact, if a widow didn't have either a family member or a wealthy person in town who would take care of her, she would have no income. You know, in some places they would have it worked out where the widows and other people who were destitute could pass through fields that had already been harvested and pick up whatever scraps were left. Or there would be cases at times where parts of the field would be left for the destitute to come by. They could pick those parts of the field for their food. But still it wasn't much, even in the best of times. And the story that I read this week wasn't about the best of times. There was a drought going on. And as we know, is so often the case, when droughts come, when things hurt in the economy, it's always the poorest of the poor who are affected most. It's this widow who's affected most. And she's out one day, she's gathering a few sticks because she's just trying to put together a little fire so she can cook the little bit of food she's been able to scrounge together. And she's out collecting these sticks when a man walks up. But he's no ordinary man. She can tell just by looking at him that this man's not from around here. She can tell just by looking at him that he's from another country, a country where they don't worship her God, a country where they even look down upon her for the God that she chooses to worship. So there's tension in the air before he even speaks, and when he speaks, he asks for a glass of water. It's not a trivial request. Is he the only one who doesn't know about this drought? Doesn't he know that every sip I give him is one less I'll have for me? But for whatever reason, she doesn't. Maybe she can tell from his appearance. He's kind of wild. He's kind of unkempt looking. You know, she can tell he's been on a long journey. Maybe she's moved by compassion. Or maybe she's so used to being looked down upon by everyone, so used to doing whatever people tell her to do that she just does it because he tells her. Or maybe she's just a kind person, but for whatever reason, she turns around to get him the glass of water, but right as she turns around, he calls out and says, "Hey, how about you fix me a little food, too?" Well, that's just too much for her. Whatever frustration, whatever anger she held back when he was just asking for water, she can't hold it back anymore. And I picture her looking around and looking this man in the eye for the first time and saying, "I swear by your God that I have nothing. You want to know why I'm out here picking up sticks? It's because all I have left is a handful of flour. All I have left is just enough oil to cook it in. And I'm just getting sticks so I can make that fire, so I can cook that little bit of food. And I'm going to give it to my son. And he and I are going to eat. And then I'm going to take him in my arms. I'm going to tell him that I love him. And then we're going to lay down and die. How dare you ask me for food?" And the man's not even ashamed. In fact, he asks her again. He says, "Don't be afraid. Just go ahead, do what you were planning to do. But first, make me a little bit of food. And by my God, I say to you," my God says, that jar where you keep your flour, that jug where you keep your oil, even though they seem empty now, they're not going to go empty for the remainder of this drought. Just make me a little food first. I can't imagine what's going on through her head. Did he not hear what I just said? Does he not care that my son and I are about to die? And who is this God of his that he promises by anyway? It's not my God. But then again, I guess my God hasn't been doing a great job lately, has he? My God's supposed to bring rain, and we're in the middle of a drought. What could it hurt? Maybe I'll give his God a try. Perhaps out of desperation it was that she made this man the little cake of bread that he asked for. And his words proved true. All through the drought, that little jar of flour, that little jug of oil never ran out. There was always plenty for her. There was always plenty for her son. There was always plenty for this man. Maybe this man wasn't an ordinary man. Maybe this man's God wasn't an ordinary God. Maybe everything was going to work out. Then a short time later, her son dies. And in addition to the grief of a grieving parent over the loss of a child, and not to trivialize that grief in any way, but she had the added grief of losing hope. This son was her one chance of getting out of poverty. If this son could have just grown up, if he could have just gotten a good job, he could have provided for her, she could have gotten out of poverty. And now that hope is gone. Her son is dead, and she starts looking for an explanation. She starts looking around, and she sees this man, this unordinary man with this unordinary God, and she begins to think, well, maybe since he's come here, maybe his God has started to see me, and his God has seen myself or my sinfulness, and maybe his God is punishing me. And she turns around and she looks him in the eye again. And she says, "What have you to do with me, O man of God?" But with the same gentleness as when he told her, "Don't be afraid," he now goes to her son. And Elijah takes her son into his arms. I hadn't told you that part yet, had I? That this man we're talking about is the same prophet Elijah that we studied last week as well. And this is what happens. I'll just read it to you what happens. And Elijah stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." The Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. The life of the child came into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, and gave him to his mother. Then Elijah said, "See, your son is alive." So the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Now I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord that is in your mouth is truth. Sounds a lot like the response of the crowd last week, doesn't it? The crowd who was gathered around, and when they saw God send down fire from heaven, they responded, "The Lord indeed is God, the Lord indeed is God." Both last week and this week, we get these 2 stories that show us people coming to faith when they run into God, when they see God at work. Last week, we saw that we often run into God when the odds are stacked against us. There were 450 prophets of the false god Baal on this side, and on this side there was just the lone prophet Elijah, and God showed up. And when the people saw God show up and they saw God send down fire from heaven, they all came to faith because they'd run into God. And this week we see another place where we often run into God. At the bottom of the barrel. This widow had nothing left. She had no food. She had no oil. She had no hope. But then God showed up, and she's brought to faith. Makes us ask the question, does this still happen? Does God still meet us at the bottom of the barrel? When I was down on John's Island about a year ago, they told me a story that's eerily similar to the story of Elijah and the widow. They told me a story about a woman living down there who was raising 11 children all by herself. So they weren't all her children by birth. Several of them were children in the community who needed a home, and she'd taken them in, but she was raising 11 children by herself in a life that I know was never easy. But then she fell on particularly hard times one day. There was a night when she opened the cupboard and all she had for dinner was a single piece of bread. One piece of bread. And so they tell me that she cut that bread into 12 tiny little pieces. She put a little butter on each piece. She filled a pitcher with water, set it on the table, called her family to the table, and they said a blessing over the food. a blessing spoken in faith, trusting that God would provide for them. And they ate their dinner. They went to bed. And when they woke up the next morning, there were 5 bags of food on their front porch. And as they tell the story down on John's Island, that family has never been hungry since. Does God still meet us at the bottom of the barrel? Oh yes, God still meets us at the bottom of the barrel. And you might be thinking, Ryan, do you really believe that God sent that food? Yeah, I do. Really? Do you really think God made that food appear out of nowhere? Well, who am I to limit God? But yeah, I'll admit it's probably more likely that somebody went out that night and bought the food and left it on the porch and slipped off. That's probably more likely than it just appearing out of nowhere by some act of divine fiat. But either way, it's still God meeting that family at the bottom of the barrel. You know, whether it's God meeting the family in a miraculous moment, a miraculous action directly from God, like those times in the hospital rooms, like the time that we celebrated with Barrett's father this week. I don't know if you've heard that story. Barrett's dad was really sick this week, and it got to the point where doctors said, you know, there's nothing more we can do. It's not going to get better. And then it did. One night they're talking about calling hospice. The next morning they're talking about calling physical therapy, and he's up reading the newspaper. Those times happen and we can't explain them. Or also those miracles sent directly by God in other hospital rooms where people don't get better. But as they're saying their last tear-filled goodbyes, a feeling of peace floods that room that comes out of nowhere, that has no explanation. Whether it's a miraculous moment like that sent directly from God, or whether it's a miraculous moment because God has put it in somebody's heart to help somebody else, either way, God still meets us at the bottom of the barrel. And so while we're on this topic, I want to say this. Never underestimate the importance of when God chooses to work a miracle through you. When God uses you to change somebody's life, to help somebody out when they're at their lowest. Because so often that's the start of faith for that other person. We look at this story of the widow. She came to faith not because of something God did directly, but because God used Elijah to heal her son. And in fact, her confession of faith, at first, if you read carefully, it's not really a confession in God. It's a confession that Elijah is a man of God. It's a confession that the words that he says about God are true. And that's so often where our faith starts. Think back. When was the first time you heard somebody talking about God and you realized that the things they were saying about God were true? And then that often leads to our own faith. So never underestimate those times when God uses you to change somebody's life, when God chooses to work a miracle through you. Because so often that's the time when people open up to hear what you're saying about God, to find out that what you say about God is true, and so often that leads them to their own faith. So don't underestimate those times when God works miracles for you. Another thing I want to say today is never think that you're too low for God to meet you where you are. The title of this sermon came from a quote I ran across this week. It was said by a fellow named Rufus Watson. He lived to be 99 years old. And he had a life where he saw all sorts of ups and downs and twists and turns as so many of us experience in life. He had quite a storied life. He was born the son of former slaves and went on to serve in the military and to make some money in insurance. And he pitched in the Negro Leagues. And he saw people being lynched for sharing his skin color. He saw all the ups and downs of life over these 90 years, had big highs and big lows. And looking back on his life, on the highs and on the lows, he said this about God meeting him at the lowest point. He said, that's where God meets us, at the bottom of the barrel. God meets us when we've gone so low that all we can do is look up. God meets us when we've gone so low that all we can do is look up. That's where the widow was. Her God, her false God, had failed her. Baal was supposed to bring rain, but he hadn't. Her pantry had failed her. She was down to her last handful of flour. Her hope that her son would provide for her had failed her. Her son had died. She was as low as she possibly could be. And that's probably why she gave God a try. It wasn't out of faith. It was out of desperation. But did you notice God didn't look down upon her for that? God didn't despise her because she came out of desperation. God didn't ask her, where have you been all these years when life was good? She'd even spent her whole life worshiping another God. And neither God nor the prophet looks down upon her because of that. And neither should we. Because God will meet us where we are regardless of where we've been. So if you've been spending time being too busy for God, or if you've spent time practicing another religion, or if you've turned away from God, or if you've ever done any of that in your life, or if you only think about God on Sunday mornings, whatever the case might be, the story of the widow proves to us that we can never be too low for God to meet us where we are. The story of the widow proves that what Paul said in Romans is so true, that nothing, including anything we can do or have done, nothing can separate us from God's great love for us. And so if you take nothing away this morning, nothing else away, please take this one truth home. You can never be too low to be met by the God who meets us all at the bottom of the barrel. Let's pray together. Eternal God, Lord, we thank you for your word. Your word that reminds us of the truth about life. That reminds us that you love us so much that nothing can separate us from you. Lord, I know there are people here today who are feeling low, who are at low points. And we all know what it is to have low points. And Lord, whether they're by our own doing or whether they're by things beyond our control, the truth remains that you are God and you love us still. So now, Lord, I ask that you will make yourself known in everyone who needs to feel you this day. Lord, for those things that we've done to turn away from you, we confess that to you now. We say we're sorry, God. And meet us here again. For that's what you do, for that's who you are. You are loving. You are merciful. Meet us where we need you most. Meet us now, Lord, as we come to this, your table.